Now, using local references is an absolutely fine way of passing the data here. But there is another way, and that uses a feature called two-way binding. We saw property binding, which is the thing with the square brackets. And there it's important to note that here I used it on my own component. I set up my own property to which I can bind with @input. But I could also bind on the normal HTML elements. For example, I could also bind the value property here with square brackets and then any dynamic value. So not some text like this. If you want to pass text, you have to add an extra set of quotes, because the part in between the double quotes here, and that is the case for property binding and for event binding and for string interpolation, this is always evaluated as a TypeScript expression. So 1 + 1 would work. If I do that, we actually see 2 as a default value, because that is what I'm binding to the value property of this input. But here I don't want to bind to that. It's just important to keep in mind that property binding is available on all elements, and you can bind to any property that specific element or component has. And the default HTML elements have a lot of bindable properties. But here, I don't want to use property binding like this. Instead, I'll use a different syntax, which looks like a combination of property binding with the square brackets and event binding with the normal parentheses. And then I bind to ngModel, and it has to be ngModel. This is a directive exposed by Angular and currently not available. We'll need to change something, but we'll soon make it available. So it's a directive made available by Angular, which supports this two-way binding syntax, as it is called, because this actually will listen to changes to the value and output changes into a property of our choice and update it with the latest value. And on the other hand, it will pass back changes into the value of this input. And to make this a bit more understandable, let's add a new property to the person input component, the entered person name, and that will be a string. And by default, let's say it's an empty string. We can now also omit this type definition because TypeScript can infer it. So it's an empty string here. And entered person name is what I'll pass here between the double quotes. Now, I mentioned that this would not be available right now. To unlock the ngModel directive, we have to go to the app module, and it's not unlocked by the browser module. Instead, we need to import another core Angular module, and that is the forms module, because this contains functionalities that help us with handling forms or user input. And we get this from Angular Forms. We have to add this in the imports array here, the forms module. This unlocks a couple of features, and amongst them this ngModel directive, which helps us again with handling user input. Now, this is available, and now we can still enter values normally here, but we can do something interesting. Remember that entered person name is the property to which we are binding with ngModel. We're not passing anything to onCreatePerson, and therefore we can't expect any argument here anymore because we're not getting any. But since this here, entered person name, is now a normal property of this component, we can use it from anywhere inside this component code. So here I can output this entered person name, and this will just be a string. And now if I go back to the running application and I enter max2 here and I click create, we still see that here. So this gives us access to this value as well. But it's two-way binding, so we can now also update the value of this input. And to do that, for example, let's say after we created a person, we want to clear it again, I can set entered person name equal to an empty string again. And if I do that and let it reload, I can enter max2, and if I hit create, you see it's reset back to an empty form, but it did receive the value correctly. And that's a nice feature we can easily implement with the help of two-way binding, which is the fourth and last form of data binding Angular knows. We have property binding with the square brackets, where we bind to properties of our own components or built-in elements. We have event binding with parentheses, where we bind to native events or our own events. I'll soon show you how this works. Or we use string interpolation, which we use anywhere where we want to output text. We use it with double curly braces. Or we use two-way binding on input elements, which allows us to get the current value, but also write to that value. So it allows us to interact with it in both directions. These are 4 crucial parts of Angular, which you'll see being used a lot in this course, and therefore it's important to understand them. Now, of course, we are not done here, because I don't just want to output the entered name here. I instead want to use that entered name and kind of pass it back to the app component so that we can add it to this array of persons there. That's what we'll do next.